Hello, everyone, and welcome to Season 3, Episode 7 of Energy versus Climate. My name is Ed Whittingham, and I'm joined by my webinar co-hosts, Sarah Hastings-Simon and David Keith. It's really good to be back for the second half of Season 3. A few Energy versus Climate listeners along the way have asked us for more content on what individuals can do to decrease their own energy and carbon footprints. And I think today's topic really fits that bill. So for many Canadians, when we think of reducing the footprints of our homes, we think of things like putting in high efficiency furnaces or high efficiency hot water tanks. And after all, for decades now, we've had government rebates and incentives that have been offered by 3 levels of government to encourage us to do exactly that. I myself have used the old federal eco-energy program. And more recently, I've used Energy Efficiency Alberta to do things like replace furnaces. But rarely are we encouraged by governments to replace natural gas appliances altogether. Now, our guest today is working on exactly that. So I first learned of Bruce Nilles during his 15-year run as the head of the U.S. Sierra Club's highly successful Beyond Coal campaign. And back in 2015, Bruce gave hugely valuable advice to Sarah, to me, to other Pembina colleagues for our own successful coal phase-out work in 2015 and 2016. And in fact, we brought Bruce to Alberta in September of 2015 to talk about the specifics of a coal plant phase-out deal that he'd been involved in Washington State before an audience in Edmonton full of regulators, environmentalists, and industry executives. And I think the audience at the time, before they heard that, viewed shutting down a coal plant as foreign and scary. But 2.5 months later, the Alberta government, under the Alberta NDP, committed to Canada's very first 2030 phase-out target. And I think there is a causal relationship, in part, between that day and their decision. So fast forward to today, Bruce is now Executive Director of Climate Imperative, which is a foundation that provides funding, support, advice, and expertise to tackle the world's most pressing climate policy decisions. Bruce is a lawyer by training. He was Managing Director at the Rocky Mountain Institute, and he lives in the beautiful Bay Area of California in Oakland. So welcome to Energy versus Climate, Bruce.
Thank you, Ed. Thrilled to join you.
So the format for the next hour, we'll talk news and not news to start. Then I'll guide us through a discussion of the topic du jour, natural gas appliances in the home, until about 45 minutes past the hour. And after that, we'll get to your questions. As always, please send them in via the Q&A box throughout the webinar. Don't use the raise hand function or the chat box. And our wonderful colleague, Mika McFarlane, will screen for live questioners. If you want to ask your question live, do so. If you're a little shy, just tell Mika. We may be able to read your question instead. All right, so let's go to news and not news. David, starting with news and not news, over to you.
I got one of each. So the news, I think, is the truckers' protest in Ottawa. I'm just talking with my parents. It's my hometown. They were environmental regulators. And for those of American listeners who don't know, it's seems like kind of Canada's yellow vest protest. It's a political populist activism in Canada from the right in a way that's pretty concerning. And the focus is COVID restrictions and other things. But I'm pretty worried that it bleeds over into a rebellion against climate action. And just yesterday, O'Toole, the head of the Conservative Party, was tooled out. And it seems pretty likely that the next head will be less moderate on climate, that is more reactionary, more anti. And that, to me is a reason to worry. I mean, Canada can be really proud of the level of broad support for climate action and what's actually been enacted, but all these things are potentially politically unstable. And I find this a pretty scary thing in Canada that hasn't seen this kind of populist protest. So I really think that is news. My not news is something I saw a bunch of times last week on climate news feeds. It was the idea that eating meat produces a lot of emissions. And I feel like I've been involved in climate for 30 years, and yes is the answer. That's absolutely true, but there's very little there that's new, and it seemed a little kind of naive the way it was stated. So these arguments that were made partly by somebody who actually sounds to profit, somebody who's behind Impossible Foods, said that if the world just magically stopped animal agriculture, you'd get these benefits of water 15% of greenhouse gases. And I guess two things. One, substantive, be careful of lumping methane and CO2 together as greenhouse gases. That uses a global warming potential. I'll come up later in this talk too. And that is correct if you believe that the world ends at 100 years and nothing has any value after 100 years. But if you believe there's a value to the world lasting longer, and then you should not weight methane quite so heavily. So that's one important policy fact. And so that kind of, they may exaggerate the animal agriculture, but the other one is just the deep naivete of the reality of how meat is coupled to people's lives. And the fact that, well, it's certainly true that eating less meat is a good idea for climate and the environment in lots of ways. The challenge is not knowing that that's the truth. The challenge is how on earth we make stable social change to get there.
I think on that second one, to me, it's similar to a lot of things that we discuss, whether it's, EVs or electrification or other. If you can give people another option that meets their needs or more, then, they're likely to take it. And I guess I would argue then when it comes to things like ground beef and hamburgers, I think the technology is getting closer there. Obviously that, will impact Alberta, but in both ways, because, I think we grow a lot of the pulses that can go into this alternative meat. So it's not just a one-way thing, but yeah, I think it's a lot around, where that technology has gotten to, and is it widely available? So if you go to a fast food restaurant, can you just easily order, the one versus the other?
But would you agree that this is this has a bigger cultural significance and higher potential for conflict? So in questions of, say we're going to get to gas furnaces, people are not that culturally tied to their gas furnaces, I think. Bruce, see what he says. And it really is sort of technological substitution is a pretty clean way to think about it. But for meat, I just don't think it's so simple. I think there are complex ties people have for and against meat. And the idea that you could just kind of wave a technological wand and substitutes, I think is pretty unlikely to be the way it plays out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I guess I would cut it finer, similar to how I think we're going to do for natural gas, that some uses in the home are people have strong attachments to, and others they don't.
Perfect.
I think we may have lost our fearless moderator. We were just saying,
I guess do you want to pick up on am I right to think of this as the LMS protest? Are you worried about these protests leading to something that shakes Canada's climate policy?
So I'm worried about the protests for a lot of reasons. Primarily for the, incredible, racist and anti-Semitic component to them. So I don't want to say that I'm not worried about them. Yep. I think over time I get less worried about the climate element of that, right? And I think it is fair to say that, the last election really was a climate election and did show that the majority of Canadians want to see policies that lead to action on climate. So, I'm still a worrier, and I worry that, you could have a conservative party that's not going to take action on climate that then, ends up in power somehow. But I think if I take a step back and look at the bigger picture, I think we've survived that test at least once.
So with Ed gone, I think it's time for you to put on your Ed hat, Sarah, since you organized this meeting. And
all right,
so do your best Ed impersonation and take over.
I will do that. So I think we'll jump.
This, Bruce.
Yeah, no problem. We'll complain about Ed's internet connection later, and we'll jump right into the conversation with Bruce. So, coming to natural gas in homes, is it more like beef in your hamburger, or more like a steak? Maybe that's where we start. You Bruce, think a lot about natural gas in the homes, about how the climate imperative behind reducing consumption of natural gas, and the size of that footprint. So maybe to just start it off, can you tell us how you came to natural gas as an issue to focus on, and what that footprint looks like in the home, why that's important?
Sure. And again, thank you for the opportunity. And the work that I was involved in and mentioned around phasing out coal-fired power plants really taught me a lot about climate as well as public health issues associated with burning fossil fuels. So in that 15 years, I thought a lot about both. and the profound impact that coal burning has both on our climate, but also the communities who live downwind. And one of the great things that I saw happening in Canada was really the sort of health community really connecting the dots between coal burning and big, profound health issues. So I thought I knew a fair amount about both. And then I was approached one day by one of my colleagues who said, have you ever thought about gas in your buildings? And I said, well, we're told it's efficient. As Ed said, we're told to buy a slightly more efficient appliance with incentives. But began digging into the fact that it turned out, unbeknownst to me, that the burning of gas in our homes is typically the biggest piece of our carbon footprint. And it was for me under my flying. And that was just a sort of a bombshell surprise, because in thinking about how do we solve this climate crisis, here was the issue right literally in my basement that I had never been told about and that wasn't in the public discourse. That people weren't talking about this. To your point, David, about yes, meat does contribute to climate change, but we've known that for a long time. Most people, if you ask them to list the 3, 4, 5 biggest pieces of that carbon footprint, would never list the gas appliances. And so the thing that brought me to this question of why should we care about gas in our buildings is because A, it is a profound climate issue. B, it is a big public health issue, which I'm happy to dig into more. And C, because we haven't had the public policy conversation, it's actually not getting any better. So it's this big piece of the overall carbon footprint of our economies, our communities, our cities, that has not been coming down. So if we believe we're in a climate crisis, we actually can't solve it unless we get our arms around how do we transition off of natural gas use in our buildings, similar to what you all have had great success doing with coal. The next big fossil fuel that needs attention is the gas use in our buildings.
Okay. I
Hi,
think we have Ed
everyone.
back.
Well, that was awkward.
Well, we didn't miss you, Ed.
Seamless.
Just smoothly took over.
Wonderful. And I had such a great news segment that we'll have to save for another show. So just catching up, I'll jumping back in. Bruce, I'd love to know more about your personal journey going from focusing on coal and focusing on grid issues to now focusing on household scale natural gas appliances. And what does that mean in sort of practical terms? Is it kind of like once you've had a bite of that apple, it's hard to stop when it comes to going after fossil fuels? Or give us that sense.
Sure. Just picking up on sort of my initial thoughts, which is, look, it's a big piece of our carbon footprint as individuals. In some cities, the burning of gas in buildings is as much as 50% of the city's emissions. So we have all these cities with climate commitments. And there are cities where literally half is transport and half is buildings. And we don't, in most instances, have cities or states and national governments with plans to do anything about it. So there's an urgent need to fix this piece of the puzzle. When I think about the sort of climate, the 4 big energy sectors, putting aside agriculture and land use, it's how do we generate electricity? And obviously there's a consensus, phase out coal and increasingly phase out gas, replace it with renewables and storage. Transport, we got to electrify most, if not all of it. Industry, lots of important work to be done there. And then there's buildings. And currently most cities in countries around the world don't actually have a plan for solving the buildings piece, which is how we heat the water, how we heat our space, dry our clothes, and cook our food. And that's the opportunity, which is, it never occurred to me the 4 gas appliances in my home were the biggest piece of my carbon footprint. And that just got me thinking about, wow, this is a ubiquitous problem. We have 70 million buildings in the US burning gas, and that's about 14% of US carbon emissions.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I actually went back and looked at my own GHG inventory numbers, and it depended on the year. Like our household GHG footprint's about 8 tons per year. Transportation accounted for about half of that. Natural gas accounted for about a quarter of that. But post-COVID, we are driving a heck of a lot less. So I wouldn't be surprised now, in spite of keeping the thermostat down, wearing layers, throwing wood on the fire in the summer, if natural gas might account for half of our current GHG footprint. But I want to get into some of the specific challenges, and we want to start with stoves, Because everyone has an opinion on stoves, and that's the hot topic, or the one with the sizzle, as you say. But maybe just give us a sense, like why haven't we focused on it? Where is the inertia in the system right now?
So in addition to a profound piece of our carbon footprint, and I like your example a lot, Ed, the other big piece is it turns out natural gas is not clean. It actually has a profound public health impact. So in doing the coal work, there was a lot of conversation, as there has been both in the US and Canada, around, well, can't we just replace coal with gas? And most folks said, well, there are some public health benefits of stopping burning coal by switching to natural gas. Now, that is on its face true, but also has some big important caveats, which is if you're trying to get to zero carbon, you can't be burning natural gas. But from a public health perspective, burning of natural gas actually emits a lot of pollution. We've spent about 50 years working how to make it slightly cleaner from power plants by putting on pollution controls to reduce the nitrogen dioxide and other precursors for particulates and ozone pollution. But the devices in our home have no controls. So the water heater has no pollution control. The furnace has no control. And so it turns out that from an outdoor air pollution perspective, here in the United States, where I have better numbers, there's about 100 million Americans living in cities where it's unsafe to breathe regularly. And an increasing piece of that overall inventory is from the burning of buildings. Here in California, we have about 30 million people where it's regularly unsafe to breathe. The contribution from buildings is about 8 times the contribution from power plants. And it's almost twice as big as all the light duty vehicles on our streets. Those were crazy numbers when I first saw them. I was like, wait a minute, we have all this important work going to reduce air pollution on power plants and cars. Why is nobody talking about buildings? And literally there's sort of been this blind spot that the regulators have had, whether it's on climate or on air pollution, that's in plain sight. The exciting news is they're finally getting serious about it over the last 12 months. But it's been a part of the emission pollution puzzle that has escaped scrutiny. And if we're going to solve this climate crisis, it's long overdue.
Mm-hmm. And then perhaps in the way that the impacts of coal-fired electricity and the negative impacts on health and its contribution to respiratory illnesses for a long time escaped scrutiny until folks like yourself started to increase that scrutiny, and then suddenly people get it. And full disclosure, when we worked on coal-fired electricity here, Sara and I with the Pembina Institute, we did quite a lot and worked very closely with medical associations to talk about the health impacts, which I think got more attention than the climate impacts. But let's then unpack the appliance.
I can't help being the energy history professor here. I mean, the first regulations on coal were in 1000 AD. The first power plant with a scrubber was in the 1890s. So concern about air pollution and coal goes back, well, roughly 10 centuries. And regulated. Yeah.
Historian noted. And actually, I will tell a story. David, you and I, we talked to a group of professors at the University of Calgary, I want to say in the mid-2000s, Chinese professors from the Central Parties University. And I remember doing a quick comparison on deaths that we attribute to coal-fired electricity. They asked what the U.S. number was, and I think you guessed, I want to say 50,000 per year.
30,000 or 50,000, something at that point. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. We asked them, what is the Chinese number? And they said conservatively 500,000 per year.
I didn't mean to derail you. And you guys did do great work. It's just important to say, so the fight against coal-fired air pollution is way old. Yeah.
Okay. So then let's take it but the fight against health impacts with natural gas stoves, I think, is very new.
Yes.
And Bruce, unpack it for us, because just through the discussions that we've had leading up to this episode with you and my own personal journey and investigations in my own house, I've been alarmed in a way that I haven't been alarmed about health impacts in quite some time. So let's start with stoves. What's going on?
Sure. So the first study I ever came across was maybe 3 years ago, and it was by the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, which is one of our big premier research institutions. And they'd done a study 4 years ago and said, we analyzed buildings, residential buildings in California, and we estimate that in the winter, when we close our windows, turn on our gas stoves, that about 55% of Californians breathing levels of nitrogen dioxide that are illegal outdoors. it didn't make any sense. We had worked on, as I said, coal-fired power plants for 15 years. We had never focused on nitrogen dioxide, which comes from the burning of fossil fuels, because outdoors in the United States, NO2 is not an issue. It's a success story. Back to your point, David, we've been dealing with it through catalytic converters and other means to make our cars, trucks, power plants cleaner, and NO2 is not on our radar. So it's one of the 6 outdoor air pollutions that our Environmental Protection Agency focuses on, but no one ever pays attention because it's largely, quote, a success. So here's a research institution saying, hey, 55% of homes breathing levels of NO2 that's illegal. So started digging, and it turns out that this is a great example of where the scientists have been studying this issue for years, but not breaking through to either regulators or the public. I had the chance to talk to a Dr. Shelley Miller in Colorado, and she described how she's been studying indoor air quality for 20 years. I'm going to paraphrase it, but she spent 10 years studying the dangers of gas stoves and then 10 years trying to fix the regulatory system because of the dangers posed by gas stoves. And in the United States, it's been a very concerted effort by the gas industry to try to obfuscate the science around gas stoves that has essentially hamstrung our regulators. But let me first sort of back. NO2 is a very dangerous pollutant. There's a reason Canada, the US, most entities in the world regulate NO2. It causes asthma attacks. And there's even an EPA scientific assessment. And in Canada, there's, quote, strong evidence it may cause asthma. And I was like, asthma, that's a big epidemic in most civilized societies. We haven't been connecting our indoor air quality and NO2 and gas stoves to asthma. That's interesting. And then I step back and just sort of intuitive start thinking about, so we've had programs to tighten up our homes, make them more efficient. We all think weatherization, reducing infiltration, particularly important in cold climates, is sort of, it's the gospel. It's a good thing to do. It's up there with apple pie and doing the right thing. But what about burning fossil fuels in this ever tighter box? Is that a good idea? Something intuitively doesn't make sense there. And then think about the warnings we have. Don't run your car inside the garage. Well, that's because burning fossil fuels in your garage is a bad idea. If you love to go camping, your little propane bottle has a very clear warning on it. Do not cook your food inside the tent. Why is that? Because burning fossil fuels in an enclosed space is a known public health hazard. Well, it turns out that gas stoves are a huge problem. Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and literally dozens of others. Most recently last week, Stanford University have published peer-reviewed studies showing that, quote, after a few minutes of cooking, just a few minutes, the levels of NO2 in your kitchen would violate outdoor EPA standards for public health, similar standards up in Canada. So this thing that we've been told by the gas industry makes us a better cook, right? I'm guessing after this, your listeners will look around and see the little blue flame everywhere. Our gas industry has done a bang-up job for decades telling us that this, quote, clean burning flame makes us better cooks and is an important part of, we've made it in society. We're successful. Turns out it's a huge public health menace that we have barely begun to address. And there's literally no regulator, with one exception here in California, who's actually taken steps to minimize people's exposure to gas stove pollution.
It is. The little blue flame is ubiquitous. And before, in one of our pre-show discussions, we were talking about a big gas utility out here, which has the Blue Flame Kitchen. Now, I mentioned I'm married to a chef. So we're going to talk about the alternative. We're going to talk about induction, and Sarah's going to give us a little primer on physics on how they work and alternatives to gas-fired furnaces as well. But without question right now, there isn't that connection here in Canada, at least, between the human health impacts. And I would add another barrier is there's actually, and especially this part of Canada, Western Canada, there is a bit of an attachment to natural gas. People connect it with jobs, and people connect it, as you talked about, to a cleaner burning fuel. I know, and I've listened to you elsewhere, Bruce. When I dropped off, I hope I didn't miss this, but I know that as a kid, you shoveled coal in Northwest England for heating and dreamed of some of that natural gas that you would get out of the North Sea to remove you from the dirty job of shoveling coal like some sort of Oliver Twist or Dickens-like character. So there's the strong attachment. And in fact, the recently disposed conservative leader that David mentioned went on a rant in front of the eternal flame in Parliament in Canada against any efforts around fossil fuel and pointed to that flame as being powered by natural gas as a proud Canadian thing. So I think there's a big psychological piece that we need to get over as well. So with stoves, let's talk about the alternative. Could you tell us about induction? And then Sara, can you talk a little bit about the physics of it?
Sure. So in learning all of this and then thinking about, okay, so gas burning in our buildings, the big climate and health issue, what are the alternatives? And are we going to ask people to quote sacrifice? The amazing thing is that the technology today to replace both products, that is heating and cooking, we have better products. And they're already sold all around the world. So we're not waiting for some amazing breakthrough technology, but they're literally on the shelves down at your local appliance stores. And from a cooking perspective, and I'll let Sara describe the physics, induction, which is essentially fancy electric, is faster, it's more precise. And by any measure, the sort of big consumer voice in the United States is outfit called Consumer Reports. They annually assess what are the best cooktops out there, what are the best ovens out there, and they hands down consistently say induction leads the pack. It is just a better cooking product if you're interested in sort of the most precise, the fastest cooking options out there.
So I can, in 2 minutes, try to explain how that works without going too deep into Maxwell's equations. But basically, the reason that you get that control, and what's, I think, one of the challenges is the way that induction stoves are very different from traditional electric stoves. So those are stoves that you have this coil and you use so-called resistive heating. So you're basically heating up that coil and that heats up your pot. With an induction stove, you have an electric wire essentially that runs around in a circle, and you send a alternating electric field, so a field that's going back and forth through that wire, and that creates an alternating magnetic field around that wire. And that alternating magnetic field then enters the base of your pot or whatever you put on top of your induction stove, and encounters resistance there and essentially heats up your pan directly. And so that's what gives you this instantaneous control. Literally, I guess, at the speed of light, your electric field is moving. And so when you turn up or down your dial and you're changing the magnitude of the electric current in your stove, you're instantaneously changing the magnitude of heating that's transferring to that pot. Unlike gas stoves, where you have the heat kind of coming up and around, you're with an inductive stove directly heating the pot itself. So that also adds, I think, a layer of control in there as well too.
And I will speak for, as I said, my wife is a chef, and I actually asked her to go and talk to chefs. And so the quick review of induction is great for sauces, a little more challenging for crisping vegetables. But two things that I would note. One, if you want to give it a try, dear homeowner who's listening today, you can start with a tabletop induction unit, which you can just put on a counter or put on an island, and use that instead of firing up the actual burner to do something like make a sauce. You can try it on an induction tabletop unit, and that will give you a sense of the power. Two, in my own personal discovery, because I was worried about venting, and I went to my gas stove, and we've got a vent, it vents outside. But after discussion with Bruce, I went and looked, and I said, well, how is it? Let's go check out on the roof. So in spite of the cold and snow here, I got on the roof and saw that my vent was completely covered with snow and ice. So that's not good. And then I did the old smoke test you have with a stick of incense and found that my bathroom fan vents better than my stove. And some members of my family may appreciate that. It's not great for indoor cooking and for those health impacts. So a no-brainer in our very short term is trying to get that venting situation sorted out, and I encourage others to check out their vents. Let's talk, we've talked about stoves. Let's talk about home heating. And David, you've got a personal experience you mentioned on the show before you're building a house with an alternative to a gas-fired furnace.
Well, or more kind of exciting, in Alberta, I feel like I'm cutting the cord. I'm building a new house with no gas line at all. So it is the all electric house. And yeah, so obviously induction stove and then a ground source heat pump with, and luckily in the geology there in Canmore, you can do direct flow between two wells, which makes it relatively cheap and more efficient. So that's kind of exciting. And I'll tell you one funny anecdote. Many people have said to me, but what about the risk of electrical outages? Isn't that, mean I'm more likely to freeze in the dark? But they haven't thought about the fact that, of course, the gas furnace does nothing if the electricity is off. So it doesn't actually, so if you think about the, failure probabilities, it actually doesn't change the failure probabilities at all. I mean, of course, we will separately have, some kind of backup gas system we can use to keep a little bit warm if electricity really went out, just a supportable thing. But it is interesting to think about it. And it's interesting how shocking it was to, it seemed like to the town, maybe count the planner people and the contractor really say, we're just not going to have a gas line.
Bruce, can you talk a little bit about on the space heating side? That's one where governments, as I'd mentioned, I guess off the top of the show, all the incentives seem to be taking out a low to mid efficiency furnace and replacing it with a high efficiency furnace. You really don't see incentives along the lines for the fuel switching along the lines of fuel is a misnomer here. The energy source switching, heat source switching along the lines of what David talked about. And there isn't necessarily the same human health hook, because as far as I can see, gas-fired furnaces are properly vented and they're vented away from where people typically do a lot of things. You're down in your utility room. What's the traction? What are some of the barriers that you're encountering when going after gas-fired furnaces?
So when we first started digging into this gas appliance issue, we were approached by several cities who were trying to work out how to get their overall emissions aligned with their climate goals. And as I mentioned earlier, in many cities, literally as much as a third to a half of their emissions are buildings, and the other third to a half is transport. And there's not a single city 2 years ago in the United States who had a plan for actually getting those building emissions down to zero. So we were approached first by the city of Berkeley, here in California. And they wanted to know, what can we do about this? Because it turned out, of course, cities give out building permits all the time. And they had never thought about giving out building permits and what the implications are for every new building attached to the gas system means for the city's climate goals. And in the United States, much like in Canada, we are building new homes connected to the gas system at a crazy rate. The American Gas Association loves to say every minute of every hour, we're adding a new gas customer to the gas distribution system. Well, from a climate perspective, that means losing, right? That's going exactly the wrong direction. So we sat down with the city of Berkeley and they wanted to know, well, what can we do? Because we're often told the only people who can regulate appliances is the federal government. There's preemption for local governments. Well, cities don't have to give you a permit to connect to the gas distribution system. So we explored putting together an ordinance. The city council reviewed it and unanimously approved it. And so in city of Berkeley, which was the first in the country for the US, as of last January, a year and a month ago, you can no longer build a new building. So everything has to be, going forward, clean, built with electric appliances throughout. Everyone was wondering, well, who's going to care what Berkeley does? Berkeley is one of our most progressive little enclaves in the country. It took off like wildfire, which is not the greatest metaphor here in California. But literally today, there's 50 cities that have banned gas in new buildings and are committed to working out how do we help people through incentives and a whole bunch of other programs transition their existing gas appliances to efficient all-electric alternatives. State of California is now considering phasing out gas entirely. The state of New York, which consumes about 10% of all the gas consumed in U.S. buildings, has a bill pending to ban gas in new buildings in that state. And so it's really one of the next major frontiers in solving the climate crisis. And it literally has gone from 0 to 60 in 2 years, from no one was talking about it to being understood as one of the central pillars. Just like clean electricity is a pillar, clean cars are a pillar, we need clean buildings. And so the nice thing about this, again, is in the US, about half the buildings are already electric. half are gas. Now, it's primarily the colder climates where we've gone to gas because gas used to be the cheaper option. But with the amazing progress on the technology around heat pumps, and I saw one of the questions in the chat was about district heating. There are cities in Europe that are now using heat pumps at the district level, both ground source and air source. The amazing breakthroughs in heat pump technology, primarily pioneered by the South Koreans and the Japanese and the Europeans, now can operate in the coldest of climates. And it is a better product. It's far more efficient than your gas appliance. So we have the technology to do this. And now it's a matter of political will to get it done.
So there seems to be a very clear GHG benefit, let's say, comparing a gas-fired furnace to the type of heat pump that David is installing. But let's talk about what if I were to go to my hardware store and put in baseboard electric heating, as we have in many parts of the country. So I'd like to know, David, Sarah, either one of you, in a place like Alberta, where we still have a pretty high carbon intensity in our electricity grid, and in spite of our best efforts with the coal phase-out target, which, by the way, Bruce, I don't know if you followed it, we're going to achieve that 7 years early. By 2023, all coal will be offline for economic reasons, and utilities have done the right thing. But when you compare that on an all-in life cycle basis, is there a savings? Does it make sense in a place like Alberta? Because I often hear the same being asked around, well, should I get an EV given that we've got a carbon-intensive grid versus just getting a more efficient internal combustion engine car?
And I want to push back, and we breeze by efficiency too quickly. First of all, as a professor, you can only use the word efficiency for comparing things that have the same starting and ending. So if you do a heat pump in a grid where, obviously, if you do replace a natural gas furnace that might have been essentially 100% or even more than 100% efficient on an LHV basis, with a heat pump that's got a COP of sort of 3, and you're doing that in a world where the marginal gas plant is a modern high efficiency combined cycle gas plant, which is over 50% efficient, you're not winning, or you're winning by a very small amount. I think the point is that you do win as we decarbonize the grids for sure. But I've done a calculation for my house, and I'm very happy to be building an all electric house. But the reality is that the carbon savings now are not so big because the grid is still relatively dirty.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to that like walking and chewing gum at the same time thing that we have to do with when it comes to electrification. So that's, electrify as many things as we can and then cleaning up the grid at the same time. And, whereas for electric vehicles, those are so much more efficient than a combustion engine, because your combustion engine in your car is not as efficient as a natural gas power plant. There, you've already crossed that threshold. I think in Alberta, especially given the, also days that we have where it does get very cold, you haven't crossed that efficiency threshold. But, I think we have to think about that long-term element. So, to me, it's a different question of ripping out high efficiency furnaces from homes today to put in heat pumps where, I think one would sit down and really have to do that math about what timescale over which that makes sense, versus saying, if I'm going to be putting in a new heating system, does it make sense to do that with a heat pump today, because the lifetime of that system is going to be 30 40 years, whatever it is. And I think we're starting to get closer to or maybe are already at the tipping point on that second one, where it does make more sense when you're talking about building new to go ahead with the heat pump versus the natural gas system.
Yeah. And I'd like to talk about that element of walking while chewing gum at the same time, because the good news, if you take it, our currently pretty carbon intensive grid here in Alberta, as we're getting that coal offline. The bad news is we have a dash for gas to make up that replacement generation. Sure, we've got a solar and wind industry that is booming, and we've talked about that before on the show. But now we have new unmitigated gas plants in the hundreds of megawatts being installed and creating lock-in and preventing the drive down of the carbon intensity. So maybe, Bruce, with your work on gas bans, give us a sense of you and your organization, Are you also looking at natural gas fired electricity and what we need to do in terms of our grids to make those electric options much better?
Sure. I mean, clean electricity is the underpinning, right? It is a foundation of a carbon-free economy. And so whether it's electric vehicles, electric buildings, electrified industry, that has to be a central part of the overall decarbonization plan. And, Canada has a 2050 commitment to be at zero, I believe. And that means electricity is and a 2030 commitment, which means your electricity is going to have to be significantly cleaner over the next 8 years. So by all accounts, it's moving in the right direction. As you flag it, it's got to go faster. But I want to pick up on one of the points that Sara made, which is working backwards from 2050 being at zero. And heating appliances last for, let's say, 20 years. The average furnace in the United States lasts for about 17 years. So let's say it's 20 years. That means by 2030, Canada needs to be installing no more gas appliances in existing or new buildings, if you're going to have a prayer meeting that. Now, that's 8 years to get it all worked out, but it is a very early stage conversation, as we're talking about, not on the agenda of most policymakers. And so how over the next 8 years do we set up the framework to transition so that by 2030, there's not a new furnace being installed or a new water heater being installed or a new dryer being installed that is powered with gas that would have to get shut down if Canada was to meet its 2050 commitment, right? So there's a math issue, just working backwards. And we have here in California, we have a 2045 net zero commitment. And what our regulators are saying is by 2028 or so, no more gas appliances sold in California, maybe 2030. But that is the regulatory framework that is underway in our state in order to meet realistically on 2050 or 2045 commitments.
Yeah. And by the way, Canada, that's very helpful, Bruce. Canada actually has a net zero grid target by 2035. And they've announced that as a target, a clean electricity standard, a performance-based standard as a tool for getting there. No further details, except some policy measures like an investment tax credit for renewables and for storage. So we're still waiting on those details. Before we turn to questions, when you say gas ban, you have an entire industry, one very powerful part of the oil and gas sector, i.e. the gas sector, that I think would get multiple eye ticks over that phrase and would push back with all its strength and might. And that's what happens. And, as the auto manufacturers did here until finally they relinquished and got on board with phase out targets of internal combustion engines. What have you done to convince all these municipalities to go ahead with these gas bans in the face of such pushback? Because I have a tough time in the near future, at least, seeing Canadian municipalities following the lead, and especially in Western Canada because of the strength of the sector. But what's your magic?
Well, the first part is that there's a simple math, which is if you're actually going to meet any serious climate commitments, you have to phase out fossil fuels, and gas is obviously a fossil fuel. When we started working on coal, the coal industry said, no, we're going to come up with some magic carbon capture and storage. We're going to do something else, a bunch of pixie dust, and the problem's going to be fine.
Clean coal. Remember that?
Clean coal. And I get that the gas industry is doing something similar. It's doing it here in the US and Europe, and I'm guessing up in Canada. Well, we'll do some hand waving and renewable natural gas will save us. Well, the little bit of renewable natural gas we get from landfills and maybe biodigesters, that's a very expensive product and we should use it very judiciously. It makes no sense whatsoever to put into our homes, not when we have a reasonable alternative like heat pumps. Secondly, the promise of hydrogen, right? Hydrogen is everyone's favorite topic on solving the climate crisis. It is the champagne of energy choices. It is expensive. It is important, and we should do it. Again, it makes no sense to put the smallest molecule we know into a pipeline system that's already leaking enormous amounts of methane into buildings that aren't actually set up today to burn hydrogen. So the whole thing, and the folks who have studied this, including our California Energy Commission, it makes no economic, technical, or environmental sense to be putting hydrogen into our buildings. So we're going to have to address that. And I get why the gas industry is saying, keep all these pipes and we'll just put some cleaner product in there. It doesn't make any sense. And so the future of what we do as the gas utilities, what we're seeing in the US is many of our gas utilities are also owned by electric utilities, and they are beginning to think through how do they do an orderly transition for their workers, for the infrastructure, and do their part to solve the climate crisis. I won't deny that the gas-only utilities in the United States are fighting tooth and nail and trying just to delay action. And they showed up to oppose the gas bans in a multitude of places. But at the end of the day, we're trying to solve the climate crisis, and you can't do there to be piping gas into our homes and burning copious amounts in our buildings.
Got it. Okay, thanks, Bruce. I want to turn to questions now. We've got Darcy Stevens, who has a question around investing in distribution. So, Darcy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thanks, everyone, for having me on the podcast today. I've been a listener for quite a while, so great to ask a question. My question is on the investment that would be required in generation and distribution technology. So, a really good discussion on heat pumps and the technical capability that we have to electrify our homes. But when we're looking at heat, specifically in Alberta, heat pumps work down to, minus 20 plus or minus, but then you need supplemental heat. And so if that's going to be electricity, that would coincide with periods of low renewable generation, as well as other peak demand that we required for electricity. So just got your thoughts on the amount of investment required on the generation side, as well as the distribution side, to enable full electrification of residential heat, specifically in a cold climate like Alberta.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts I could start with. I think it's a great point, and yes, we know that we are going to need more electricity as we electrify more things. So I think, on the one hand, I think it's important to keep in mind that we have historically gone through periods of increase in electricity demand, right? And the last decade or two, less so in Alberta, although we're starting to see the same thing here too, given changes within the industry. But certainly on the residential side, we've had a period where there hasn't been such a growth in demand because of energy efficiency measures, kind of giving a haircut to that growth. But if you go back to the decades before, the pace of increase in demand for electricity that we're talking about, if you look at what it would take to, conservative estimates around electrifying buildings across Canada, is something that we've met previously, in the 70s and 80s when we saw similar periods of growth. So, yes, it's a challenge, but it's not one that hasn't been met before. Of course, there's different challenges around permitting and building of projects, but on the flip side, we have more renewable energy options that we had at the time. So I think it's, yes, there's something to overcome there. I think to me, it ties back to this base question of, what are all the pieces that have to come together to decarbonize our grid? And again, if we're smarter about it, there are better ways to do this. So for example, when you talk about electrifying hot water, and this is something that I think California has already started to do. Bruce can probably correct me, but the hot water tank in your home can be a really good source of distributed energy storage, right? And so the way to make this electrification work without it becoming unaffordable is not to kind of just do the sort of, I don't want to call it like the stupidest thing of rush to electrify everything without thinking about efficiency and without thinking about time of use and options for storage, but to really look more holistically at the ways that we produce and consume electricity and look for those options of, okay, well, if we're going to electrify hot water, can we actually do so in a way that gives some control to utilities around that hot water heater as a resource? Again, with limits, obviously you have to make sure that people have hot water available when they need it, but there is a lot of flexibility in the system that we are going to be able to tap into as we meet that challenge of increasing demand.
And Sarah, can you explain, like in 30 seconds, because I know you can also give utilities the right to control your thermostat as a way of, say, balancing supply, like if it's baseboard heating, balancing electricity load, if it's your gas-fired furnace, balancing natural gas supply. But hot water tank, just 30 seconds, how can that be used by utility as a form of energy storage?
So I guess the way the tanks work, I'm not actually sure whether it's just I think one way to do it is that you make them a bit hotter, right? So when you use hot water in your home, you're not usually using water at the temperature at which it comes out of the hot water tank, right? You're mixing it with some amount of cold water to make it the temperature you want it. And so when you talk about hot water availability, if you preheat essentially your tank and you're able to use that and not need to replenish that immediately, or do that preheating, and so the heating is happening before rather than right at that point, that gives you the ability to time shift that temperature, or sorry, that energy demand.
Gotcha.
I just want to go ahead, Bruce.
I think I would just add that you have some amazing uses of current electricity that probably can be adjusted at peak heating times. I'm thinking in particular your aluminum industry, right? You have one of the cleanest, world envious aluminum production operations in the world. There's no reason that the vacation of the aluminum workers can't be combined with those few days in January when you have the coldest winters, when you know that the electricity demand for heating will be the highest, right? So you have some amazing assets that just require some planning and sort of coordination to make sure that when you do have those coldest days in January, February, that you're minimizing the strain from all the other sources of electricity. So there's some water heaters are great. Other mechanisms, demand response programs are great. You also have this industrial load that probably has some flexibility. And have we thought about how do we really integrate that into this opportunity?
I'll throw a little bit of skepticism. I agree that in the long run that we're going to electrify a huge chunk of the economy. And I really agree in the long run we're electrify and do house heating. But I think, especially as far north as Canada, I think we don't have right now a clear pathway to decarbonize the grid. The government can make claims, but the reality is there isn't a technically economic pathway. The kind of things, I've actually in my house am doing that energy storage thing with a very large tank, and it doesn't buy you very much. And if you're going to run this sort of substantially on solar with a big seasonal cycle, as well as a diurnal cycle, or you're going to try and deal with wind where there's significant long-term low period variability, these things are hard. And I don't think we're going to magically get cheap storage to solve it. So I don't think there's any doubt that we can do it. But I don't think it's quite as black and white as Bruce says. So for example, I broadly agree that I don't see like switching the whole grid over to hydrogen. I don't think makes sense. There may be some places at the margin where adding a little hydrogen to the gas grid makes sense. Because as much as Bruce argued from if we decarbonize at the 1.5 point, well, yeah, but it's not by any means clear that we will. And I think they're genuine hard questions. It varies very much by location. In some places, it's much easier to imagine decarbonizing the grid fast.
Just pushing back on that, David, how much of Canada's electricity comes from hydro?
Canada's a big hydro component. 35, I'm going to guess. Sarah, it's maybe a little higher.
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 Well, higher, 250.
But Alberta, of course, much less.
Yeah,
You have the very best storage system in the entire world for huge amounts of wind and solar, right?
Absolutely. I'm very keen on that. I have a student working on that right now. I've worked on that interconnect, but there are a bunch of issues. First of all, actually reconfiguring it to do storage is not as easy as you think, and there are environmental impacts. Second of all, you've got to do a lot of HVDC long distance transmission. Yep. I've been arguing we should do that to integrate with the US grid much more. Totally agree. But the gap between the fact that makes sense in technical economic terms, absolutely true. People have heard me argue that on this show a lot before. The gap between that and actually doing it, given that we are 2 or 3 orders of magnitude away from the rate of build we need to for long distance transmission to do this. So again, I don't disagree about the long term, but I do think that one of the there challenges here to think about where the Berkeley model gets transitioned to the whole world.
Yeah, and so I would love to talk more about the grid. We've talked about strategic interconnects. I've said we can't be allowing unmitigated gas-fired electricity on the grid if we're serious about this target. We will know more from the government when it outlines its pathway to getting to a net zero grid by 2035. Perhaps we come back and we tackle it then, but I don't see how it's going to happen without strategic grid interconnects. And the problem is no one wants to take that leadership in the country right now. Okay. Let's go to John Venderheide, and sorry, John, if I've butchered your last name. You've got a question on Enbridge.
Yes. First, I want to thank Bruce for his comments and sharing his expertise, and the E versus C group for a great topic today. I want to, I'm on the path to electrifying our home in Guelph, Ontario. And I came across information that Enbridge, the gas distribution company in my area, is wants to run trials putting hydrogen into natural gas. And that got me to thinking, is there another alternative to electrification for me in the long term, or is this just something in the short to medium term to reduce emissions by a little bit, or is it the gas company, just playing a little bit of diversion to maintain their business as is, status quo, in the medium to longer term? It's going to, putting hydrogen in, I understand, would involve some investment. The metallurgy of the piping system, I understand, might be a little bit different. Is that worth the investment?
John, that's a great question. There's a lot of buzz about hydrogen in Canada, period. Bruce, you mentioned this. And yes, it depends on how the hydrogen is produced. If it's electrolytic hydrogen or hydrogen that's made with carbon capture, you can drive it down. And what I gather is you can blend it into a gas stream up to 20% and still run your appliances. But Bruce, love to get your thoughts on it.
I think you nailed the big point, Ed, which is maybe we can get to 20%, maybe, and then you have to change out a whole bunch of the system, including your appliances. I urge you John, take a look at what the California Energy Commission did. They did an extensive study looking at the promise of hydrogen, and hydrogen does have enormous potential if it's green in various aspects, including industry. It makes no economic sense to put it into our buildings. And so take a look at what sort of the best non-gas industry science says. And from an economic and a technical perspective, we're not going to run it through millions of miles of gas distribution system.
Great. I think we have time for one more quick question. I'm going to read it. Thanks to Barry McNichol for your question. And this is about priorities. Again, listeners have asked us, what should we be doing as individuals at the household level? His question is, if you rank cars, furnaces, stoves in relation to time to replace, and I would say probably with cost and GHG savings, it would appear that cars are first and stoves last. So with the current focus on EVs, how do we convince the public to replace that stove even though it's working fine? He's responded to something I've said, and yes, your wife is correct. Preparing a béarnaise sauce is easy with gas and difficult with induction. And he speaks from experience. He has both at his house and cottage. So, Bruce, you've worked on this rank. I'd love to hear your order of priority.
Look, if you have a brand new gas appliance, don't rip it out today and replace it with electric. Prepare your home, because everything's going to break, right? Your water heater lasts 8 to 10 years, your furnace 17 years, your stove should get replaced from a public health perspective as soon as possible. Have your house ready for being all electric. And so when your water heater does break sometime in the next 10 years, you're ready to replace it. I would say the same with your car, which is do it in an orderly way, but be ready for when it happens, because when your water heater breaks, you're not going to want to go weeks without having the alternative. So preparing your home, all electric, get it ready, and then do it over the next 5 or so years.
I think, go ahead, Sarah.
I was going to say, I like that answer a lot. I mean, I'm reflecting, so I'm a mom with youngish kids, not so young anymore, but it's still shocking to me when thinking about, how many things you're bombarded with as a new parent around, what's going to be safer for your kids, this or that. Like it probably went down a million rabbit holes. And I actually, in stoves never came up, right? And so I think that is something that we do need to be thinking more about, more broadly, right? Like the image of this kitchen with your beautiful gas stove as the centerpiece of that, and there's clearly more education and thought that needs to go into that. So I would definitely rank that high. Thinking about your own personal health and health of your family.
I will offer one last comment, Ed.
Go ahead, David.
Just on, I think this new knowledge about the health impacts of gas stoves and added reason to switch off that Bruce brings, I really think is useful and important in a campaigning sense, important in a public health sense. I think it also is important to have perspective of the difference between this, a global perspective. So in the first world, absolutely yes. The poorest 1.5 billion or so people are cooking on solid fuels with gigantic health impacts from doing so that dwarf the health impacts we're talking about. For many of them, actually getting gas is the right answer, getting LPG now, because the total cumulative emissions of getting MLPG is very small and the health benefits are huge. And yes, in the long run, the answer is going to be electric and induction, presumably almost everywhere. But in the long run, by the time that happens, those people will be dead. And so we really do need to think about how to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time for climate policy. And what's right for the rich world isn't necessarily right for the poorest parts of the world.
Yeah, good point, David. And let's acknowledge the luxury that we have when we're considering something like a gas stove versus an induction stove. We're in a fortunate place to not have to be heating with biomass or cooking our food with biomass. But I can tell you after this show and the lead up to it, I'm looking at my gas stove in my kitchen with a whole new set of skeptical eyes. And on the short term, I'm going to solve that venting problem. The longer term, I'm going to negotiate with my chef wife to see what we can do on induction, even if it's a hybrid solution. So listen, we're out of time. Thanks, Bruce. Bruce Nilles, you're a wonderful guest. It's great to have you back in Canada talking about our issues, even if virtually from a distance in Oakland. We're really, really grateful.
Thank you. Very much enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks a lot.
So a reminder, this episode is going to be available for listening or download at energyversusclimate.com. Also available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Please rate us. We appreciate it. And give us feedback to energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Our next episode is going to be in mid-February. We want to unpack corporate net zero commitments. We're still working to finalize our guests. Hey, actually, if you have any suggestions, we've got a couple of people in mind. Feel free to zip them into energyversusclimate@gmail.com. You can support us at energyversusclimate.com. And a big thank you to Christina Pearson, Crystal Hickey, and Mika McFarlane for all their webinar support. And as always, to our very patient producer, Eva Wojnicescu. Thanks, everyone. See you next time.